If there is a single country in Europe that has a tangible reason to feel threatened by the results of 2016 US presidential election, it is definitely Ukraine. The very fact that Donald Trump has won the election means just one thing for Ukrainian political establishment. The very pro-Ukrainian administration of Barack Obama will be soon replaced by much more isolationistic Donald Trump team that is more likely to be attached to its pragmatic policy of reapproachment with Russia than the policy of saving Ukraine at any cost. That means that in case of reinvigoration of any skirmishes in eastern Ukraine, President Poroshenko may have a very hard nut to crack, whether to ask President Trump for help or focus straightforward on the strategy of meeting the President Putin's demands, as it is unlikely that the US leader will be even willing to make his case heard. As we remember, Ukraine has experienced a great political turmoil ever since the end of 2013, when, following the Euromaidan process in Kiev against President Viktor Yanukovych, the Ukrainian opposition decided to rebel against his rule and his controversial decision to do not sign an association agreement between this country and the European Union. Admittedly, during this turbulent time, the democratic administration of US President Barack Obama has offered the members of Ukrainian opposition full diplomatic, political, logistic, and financial support in their fight against the regime. This assistance, combined with Viktor Yanukovych's strategic mistakes of the use of power against the peaceful demonstrators, have resulted in countless casualties that in turn has tripled the balance of power in Ukraine in favor of the anti-regime movement and effectively has resulted in Viktor Yanukovych fleeing the country and seeking a refuge in neighboring Russia. Consequently, the annexation of Crimea and the eruption of civil war around the cities of Donetsk and Luhansk in eastern Ukraine have unfolded soon after the newly appointed Prime Minister Arseniy Yatsenyuk had replaced more pro-Russian authorities in Kiev. Despite of the fact that the 44th President of the United States did not involve militarily on behalf of the Ukrainian opposition at any stage of these events, he had shown a huge enthusiasm in defending the newly formed Ukrainian government on the global stage, both within the UN Security Council, when US Ambassador to the UN Samantha Power has compared Russia to a thief that can steal but cannot own Crimea, and elsewhere, where, together with the European Union leaders, President Obama has imposed a number of sanctions and other harsh measures on the Kremlin for the annexation of this peninsula. Unfortunately, even with all of the sympathy that one can have for the Barack Obama administration, the policy playbook of this politician has turned out to be extremely ineffective, especially in comparison with the President Putin's blueprint. Ever since 2014, visibly, the Russian leader started to outmaneuver his US counterpart, who, together with his Western partners, have disregarded the very fact that the only language that Russia traditionally understands is the language of power politics, and have decided to pursue a dovish policy towards Russia. If anything, the sanctions regime that the White House has imposed on the Kremlin in 2014 have had a bigger detrimental effect on the countries that have had traditionally strong economic ties with Russia, such as Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Romania, Moldova, and Bulgaria, than Russia itself. Not to mention the fact that these Western repercussions have actually helped Russian plans to cut down on bureaucracy, launch various protectionist policies, and take more direct measures to reform the economy. Not to mention the fact that Russia has managed to actually reach out to quite unorthodox partners such as Egypt, Pakistan, India, China, and more recently Japan, considering the fact that Western powers were not willing to do business with Kremlin. Naturally, the way President Putin has handled 2014 Western sanctions has resembled building a house of cards, as prioritizing hard power over soft power prerogatives must have looked very archaic, if not naive, to anyone in the West. But to his countryman, it was like pulling up yet another ace from his sleeve, And the best Barack Obama could do to respond to these consecutive Russian checkmate moves was to either criticize Russia or to subject this country to yet another weak sanction regime that had very little meaning for Russia. One may of course ask, how on earth can we explain this phenomenon that instead of bringing Moscow to its knees, the Western sanctions have actually persuaded Russia's political establishment to evoke more assertive foreign policy? Well, to start with, we need to understand that the Western leaders have failed to take into consideration the very fact that the Russian has had a huge deal of experience in dealing with sanction policies. It took some 74 years for the economic isolations and central planned economy to have a tangible knockout effect on the USSR. So it may take a while before a semi-liberalized Russian economy will start feeling a true scope of economic hardship imposed on this country by the Western powers. Over the last few years, President Putin has regained a commanding position for his country, and it is thanks to his decisiveness, a clear sense of direction and purpose that have clearly contrasted with incompetence of the Barack Obama administration and his European colleagues. To everyone's surprise, during this time, Russian leader was able to consolidate his power and build the reputation of the fearless leader determined to define the unfavorable global reality that has emerged in the post-Soviet Union global environment. Admittedly, during this time, Barack Obama's anti-Russian rhetoric was very strong, but it has proven to be quite empty, as there was no real substance behind clearly pro-Ukrainian declarations, as the 44th president of the USA has eventually failed to do enough to constrain the increasingly assertive bully that started to behave in the backyard of its western neighbor like an elephant in the china shop. Having said that, one has to admit that with the forthcoming change of guard in the White House, Ukraine is inevitably losing one of the biggest supporters of its pro-transatlantic aspirations, as the president-elect seemed to be quite ambivalent about the Ukrainian future. Indeed, when we take into consideration some of the Donald Trump's electoral promises, especially suggestions that the NATO countries will have to take more responsibility for their own protection from now on, there is not much left for a country like Ukraine that relies heavily on the Western unyielding support. It is not that the Kiev's chances of joining NATO and European Union are at stake here, but also the very existence of this country in its current form might be at stake, as the moment the US unconditional commitment to protecting this country's sovereignty ends, the Ukrainian people may face severe consequences of that decision. Let us be clear in this case. If we add to this Ukrainian equation the fact that the president-elect plans to cut down on US over-deployment of its military personnel abroad, and most importantly, wants to desperately reach out to Russia, the Ukraine's position is becoming even more peculiar. It is high time that Ukraine's corrupted elites came to their senses and tried to elaborate an effective strategy of persuading newly elected President of the United States to follow his predecessor's footsteps and offer Ukraine protection because of strategic reasons. Naturally, from the first side, the first instinct suggests that if Donald Trump was asked today to choose either to support Ukraine or give up on this country altogether in exchange for the better Washington-Moscow ties, he would have chosen the latter option. Indeed, Donald Trump is considered to be much more ruthless than his predecessor, and he harbors much more nationalistic views than perhaps any American president in the last 50 years. But even if President Trump was willing to give up the US global position as the world policeman, he should think twice before handing over Ukraine on the silver platter to Russia, as that would have meant a massive strategic mistake at the outset of his presidency. Ukraine is far too important to be ignored, as this country, in geopolitical terms, accounts for the key to the leadership over Eurasia. In order to understand this phenomenon, one may consider reaching out to Zbigniew Brzezinski's global chessboard that suggests that with Ukraine, Russia is an empire. Without Ukraine, Russia is just a country. So President Trump needs to answer one simple question for himself: whether he is comfortable with Russia, that is already very assertive, getting even more hawkish in the event of subjugating Ukraine to its will, or whether he will be willing to come up with a strategy that will actually resolve the Ukrainian-Russian hostilities and improve US-Russia relations in the meantime. That is a very good reason behind such a state of affairs. Of course, Russia is almost entirely responsible for involving in Ukraine's internal affairs. But as harsh as it sounds, the Ukrainian politicians are to be blamed for not doing enough to protect their country from foreign invasions. If Ukraine had a stable government for the last 25 years, the recent events would have never took place. Also, it is important to emphasize on the fact that the successive US presidents have no moral responsibility of involving on behalf of the Ukrainian people or paying off their debts simply because the incompetent political elite decided to use their national tax system to indulge their personal needs. After all, the Ukrainian future and its sovereignty depends predominantly on its own government. Yet still, instead of focusing on reforms, some members of political establishment in Ukraine believe that there is a time for another revolution, another Maidan, and that's like shooting in their own feet. Simply because, well, when we consider the fact that Russian intervention in Syria is heading into its conclusion because the Battle of Aleppo has been won by Bashar al-Assad and Russia, and the fact that Syrian and Ukrainian civil wars are uh, intrinsically interlinked due to the fact that intensity of the skirmishes in eastern Ukraine have declined ever since the start of the Russian intervention in Syria in September 2015. So now when Russian forces will be released soon from Syria, anything can happen. So it is in the best interest of Ukrainian political establishment to improve the internal situation in the country and reach out to President-elect Donald Trump to make their case heard. Otherwise, they will be subject of global politics all over again. On behalf of International Relations Daily, it was Piotr Pietrzak. It was a pleasure to talk to you. Please subscribe to this channel if you want to see similar videos in the future.